On the right, the Watkins baby, or is it the Bamberger baby? On the left, the Bamberger baby, or is it the Watkins baby?
If you gave birth at a hospital, how well do you trust that the baby you go home with is the baby you gave birth to? Today, most hospitals still rely on name tags, though with some high-tech gadgets like security cameras, barcode scanners, and foot and fingerprint readers, and of course there's DNA testing if maternity or paternity of a baby is called into question. But that wasn't the case in 1930, a time when hospital births were just starting to become usual, and then only in larger cities, and postpartum stays could last over a week. Today I'm going to share the story of the Great Chicago Baby Mix-Up, which made international news and jolted the patient identification medtech industry into action. On June 30th, 1930, at the Englewood Hospital in Chicago, Mrs. Margaret Watkins' firstborn child came into the world at 4:47 p.m. Her husband, Mr. William Watkins, a traffic manager, was waiting with the other expectant fathers when he was told he had a son.
Say, you don't think they'll get my boy mixed up with the others, do you?
Perhaps Mr. Charles Bamberger, a bricklayer, overheard Mr. Watkins' good news while waiting for his own. A couple hours later, Mr. Bamberger would learn that he too had a new son, his third child, born at 6:23 p.m.
Oh, she's fine. Everything was fine. Baby weighs 7 pounds, 1 1/3 ounces.
According to Lynn Curry in the Encyclopedia of Chicago, in the 1930s, almost half of all births in the city, 45%, were midwife-assisted home births, but not always by choice. Women who did give birth in a hospital often stayed for 1 to 2 weeks and received a lot of help caring for their newborns from nursery staff. Our Mrs. Watkins and Mrs. Bamberger shared a room for 10 days before they were discharged on July 9th. On July 12, 1930, at their apartment home on West 82nd Street, Mr. Watkins decided that he would give his new baby a bath. As he undressed the wee mite, he found a sticker of sorts on the baby's back. Written on it in permanent red marker, it read, "Bamberger." Panic set in. Did the hospital give him the Bamberger's baby? If so, where was his baby? Depending on who is telling the story, Mr. Watkins then calls up Mr. Bamberger over on South Paulina Street to tell him what he found. Mr. Bamberger said that they had found a similar tag saying Watkins in the bassinet but had thrown it away. Both families contacted the hospital, and the hospital insisted that the tags must have ended up on the wrong babies following a bath in the nursery, but that the babies definitely went to the correct homes. Unsatisfied with this answer, Mr. Watkins contacted Dr. Arnold H. Kegel, the health commissioner of Chicago at the time, now famous for those pelvic floor exercises, and he promptly started an investigation. Initially, they ran blood tests which came back inconclusive because everyone involved had the same blood type. This was before the rhesus factor was tested for too. Then they considered the skin pigmentation, but that too failed because each family had one fair and one dark-complected parent. Dr. Kegel hoped that anthropology, read eugenics, would clarify the situation, saying, quote, "Our chief hope is anthropology. One of the babies is Semitic, the other is Caucasian. Experts analyzing the different racial characteristics of the head, hair, and features should be able to throw some light on the secret. However, they look alike as 2 peas in a pod," unquote. According to an article in the Norwich Sun, Dr. Kegel set up an experimental lab in his home and invited pathologists, ophthalmologists, dermatologists, obstetricians, criminologists, fingerprint experts, attorneys, and jurists. They took blood and hair samples, skin scrapings, and photomicrometerings, as well as x-rays of the parents and the babies. Those poor babies.
Mr. Ferguson's office? Oh, hello. When did you arrive in Chicago?
At 11 a.m. on July 24, 1930, Dr. Kegel and 2 officials of the International Society of Medicine, Dr. Francis E. Harrington of Minnesota and Dr. C.C. Slelmans of Michigan, plus Chief Justice Harry Olson of the Municipal Court, and a panel of 13 experts set in on a final conclave at Dr. Kegel's office. The experts gave their findings. Dr. Gerhard von Bonnen, an anthropologist of the University of Illinois, made microphotographic and X-ray measurements of the bones, skull, and members of the babies and parents to look for hereditary details, concluding on the basis of head measurements that the babies had been switched. Dr. Eastman and his aides also looked at the babies' heads, explaining that because this was Mrs. Watkins' first baby, it would have an oblong head, whereas Mrs. Bamberger already had 2 children and her baby would have a round head. This is 100% crap, just in case you're wondering. But based on what they determined, round versus oblong, they agreed that the babies had been switched. Dr. Hamilton R. Fishback performed the blood test, which, quote, showed conclusively that the blood of the baby in the Bamberger home was identical with that of Mr. and Mrs. Watkins, unquote. Dr. Cleveland White, an associate in dermatology at Northwestern University, examined the birthmarks on the Bamberger baby, and Mrs. Bamberger, they were only incidental and not even the same type, so they had no scientific value. Of the 13 experts consulted, 2 refrained from passing judgment, and only 1 dissented, Dr. Ferdinand Watzek, the world-famous criminologist. He was a detective from Vienna working as the director of the Northwestern University Crime Lab, and who communicated through an interpreter. He said that based on the fingerprints, he believed the babies went to the right parents. The overwhelming majority of the experts believed that the babies had been switched and that they should be switched back. But Mr. Bamberger didn't agree, saying, quote, "I won't give up the boy I have. I'll barricade my house and hire a lawyer," unquote. Mrs. Bamberger hadn't been well enough to attend the conclave, but Mrs. Watkins was there with the baby they had been sent home with. She waited with a gaggle of reporters in the hall, and it was noted that the conclave didn't even break for lunch. They went straight through to 1 p.m. when Mr. Bamberger stormed out, after which they stopped Dr. Kegel and goaded Mr. Watkins into saying, quote, "I'll go out there and take my baby by force," unquote. Meanwhile, at the Bamberger's home, there was already a frenzy of press, looky-loos, and neighbors. Some reporters banged on Mr. Bamberger's door to get a statement. They described him as, quote, "a distraught man in shirt sleeves who said that he was upset and his wife was hysterical," unquote. Mr. Bamberger felt that the whole situation was a political stunt. Quote, "I know my own baby and nobody is going to take him away from me. My wife is convinced the baby is ours. I guess a mother's instinct is as good as the opinions of a lot of medical experts. Bah," unquote. Soon after, the crowd watched as Mr. Bamberger drove away with his older children and wife, with the contested baby in her arms. When Mr. and Mrs. Watkins and Dr. Kegel arrived, there was a message from Mr. Bamberger's lawyer that he had advised Mr. Bamberger to shoot Dr. Kegel as a trespasser if he set foot on his property. Dr. Kegel made sure to pass that message on to the press, and Mr. Watkins said that he would see his lawyer in the morning about a kidnapping warrant. Long after the crowds dispersed, around midnight, over at the Keystone Hospital, Mr. Bamberger's attorney and the head of the hospital, Dr. Louis Kiesman, and 5 doctors appointed by him had their own secret conference where they decided the babies were in the right homes.
It is my contention and the contention of my associates that the babies are in their correct homes. We believe there are certain characteristics present in both babies that are found in the father and mothers of both babies. Scientifically, the Watkins baby is the first baby born of this family and is naturally, as usually found, a smaller baby. The Bamberger baby is the 3rd baby born in this family and is usually a little bit larger than the first baby.
When Mr. Watkins was informed of these other experts' opinions, he didn't accept them. Instead, the Watkinsons decided that they would take the case to court to have it settled legally. After all, whichever baby they ended up with would be the heir to their property, and they didn't want another baby showing up later to dispute it. Mr. Watkins added that he wasn't so concerned about future money, but about their attachment to the lad. Quote, "If we wait much longer, we'll be so crazy about this baby we'll hate to give him up," unquote.
Mr. Watkins, what is your present opinion as to the parentage of this baby?
My personal opinion, Mr. Loughnane, at first, was that we had the wrong baby. I had great faith in the blood test, but after talking to several eminent physicians, I have found out that the blood test is fallible. At the present time, I'm not convinced as to whether I have the right baby or not, and it will require other tests that I have in mind to prove which is which.
While Mrs. Watkins wasn't just dealing with mothering her first baby, but a colicky baby at that, and Mrs. Bamberger found herself less than secure in her beliefs about the baby in the Watkins home. Quote, "If only people wouldn't keep telling me he looks like me or like his daddy and get me mixed up," unquote. The following morning, July 26th, Mr. Barrett O'Hara, attorney for the Watkinsons, former Lieutenant Governor of Illinois and later member of the House of Representatives for Illinois District, announced plans to sue the Englewood Hospital for $100,000 in damages, which is about $1.8 million in 2022, with the hope that it would recover the Watkins baby from the Bambergers. Almost as a rebuttal to the news of the lawsuit, that afternoon the Bambergers announced that they would be christening their baby that following afternoon. The Watkinses responded that they were considering an injunction to prevent the ceremony. And zooming out a bit, the baby mix-up was fast becoming a cause célèbre for local activists. The newspapers reported that, quote, "A group of Chicago women prominent in civil work arranged for a mass meeting of mothers next week to demand that maternity hospitals take proper precautions to prevent future confusion in the identity of children," unquote. On July 27th, it turned out that the Bambergers were fibbing about that afternoon christening. Not only did they have it done in the morning, but at a different location. The baby in the Bambergers' custody was christened George Edward Bamberger at Our Lady of Solace Catholic Church at 9 a.m. in a, quote, "hasty ceremony," unquote. The Bambergers said they lied about the time and place to avoid legal interference from the Watkinsons or Mr. O'Hara, and they insist that now that the baby's name was in the church records, the identity dispute was settled. Mr. O'Hara told the press that if his client ordered him to do so, he could file a writ of petition of habeas corpus, which would require the Bambergers to produce the baby in court, and if they refused, the sheriff would seize the infant for the same ends.
Mrs. Bamberger, would you give this baby up?
No, I would not give up anything in the world.
On July 28th, Mr. O'Hara filed a suit for $100,000 for lost identity on behalf of John Doe, the baby in the Watkins care, against Englewood Hospital Association, adding that tomorrow he intends to file a similar $100,000 suit on behalf of Mr. and Mrs. Watkins. Mrs. Watkins made a statement to the press, quote, "We don't want to force the Bambergers to give up their baby, or our baby. That isn't the idea. We may have the right baby after all. We can't figure out why the Bambergers can be so sure they have theirs. They seem pretty positive," unquote. Mr. and Mrs. Watkins added that the christening was all right with them. Quote, "No matter what he's been christened, if I find he's mine, I'll take him. I don't plan to have this baby baptized," unquote. Whereas Mr. Bamberger only had this to say from his front door, quote, "It's settled from my point of view. See my attorney," unquote. Fair enough. Mr. Watkins' parents, Mr. and Mrs. Evan Watkins, saw a photo of the babies and felt that there was a distinct likeness between their son as a baby and the baby in the Bamberger home. So they found a photo taken of Mr. William Watkins as a 4-month-old and sent it to the officials at Englewood Hospital. On July 29th, newspaper editors from coast to coast must have spontaneously combusted with glee. Mr. Watkins was being accused of being a bigamist by a cabaret dancer from Philly. Mrs. Anna Van Stan Watkins was a cabaret girl and or nightclub entertainer, depending on who's telling the story. She was living in Philly when she saw photos of Mr. William Watkins, her estranged husband and father of her son, in the newspaper, with his new wife and new baby. As it turns out, Mr. Watkins had married Anna in 1917 when they were both 17 years old. The following year, he sailed for France to fight in World War I while she stayed behind and gave birth to their son. According to Mrs. Anna Van Stan Watkins, what a name, Mr. Watkins simply abandoned her and their son. According to Mr. Watkins, they separated in 1921 and had the divorce finalized in Chicago in March of 1928, the same month and year that Mrs. Margaret Stahl Johnson was finalizing her divorce. Mr. Watkins and Margaret married on June 29, 1929. This threw a wrench into the works for Mr. O'Hara to file the second lawsuit on behalf of the Watkinsons, because if Mr. Watkins was a bigamist, then Mr. and Mrs. Watkins aren't married and their natural son, whichever baby it is illegitimate. But Mr. O'Hara had multiple plates a spinning. He was also working for those concerned mothers, in particular Mrs. Grace DeBrell's group, who had him file a bill in equity in the circuit court asking for a judicial review and finding to establish the infants' identities. On July 30th, Mrs. Watkins, without Mr. Watkins, filed a $100,000 suit against Englewood Hospital for agony of doubt and fear. The following day, the Associated Mothers of Illinois was created, and they sponsored state legislation to prevent this kind of baby mix-up from happening ever again. Mr. O'Hara was their attorney, and he urged them to advocate for a law requiring monthly hospital inspections and a special committee for suggestions on solving the Watkins-Bamberger baby mix-up. By August 2nd, the Chicago Medical Society officially recognized the baby mix-up. In a conference with their president-elect, Dr. John R. Harger, and Dr. Kegel, they emphasized that all the city's hospitals had marking systems for newborns, but they conceded that they should implement a uniform plan, which included 2 legal witnesses. Of course, all this time, Englewood Hospital was getting a lot of negative publicity. So the hospital superintendent, A.E. Paul, finally published an article on the issue in the trade magazine, Hospital Management. The New York Times reported secondhand what was to be included in this article. Quote, "The evidence supporting this conclusion is, first, that the adhesive tape identifying each baby was attached to each baby promptly after its birth and remained upon the babies until after they left the hospital. Second, that the weight of the Watkins baby taken 5 days after it left the hospital corresponded with its record of daily weights taken while it was in the hospital. Third, that the mothers seemed satisfied on leaving that at all times during their stay in the hospital they nursed the same baby as the one they took home from the hospital. And fourth, that the parents of the Bamberger baby believe that they have the right baby and have had it baptized as theirs and refuse to give it up." Unquote. The following Monday, Judge Joseph Sabbath was to review Mrs. Watkins' petition for a writ of habeas corpus. The situation promised to be drawn out and physically and financially grueling. Then Mrs. Bamberger changed her mind. And then she changed her husband's mind. And then they called Dr. Kegel, who had them all rush over to Mrs. Watkins' apartment while Mr. Watkins was out at a ball game. A little tearful, the 2 mothers undressed the respective infants, exchanged them to each other's arms, and embraced. Centralia Daily Chronicle reported that when Mr. Watkins came home, he got upset about the exchange, claiming that the Bambergers took advantage of his wife while he was gone. He threatened to sue them, but it never came to anything. On August 29th, Judge Sabbath settled the case. The babies were in the correct homes since the swap, and that's where they will remain. He added, quote, "The Bambergers and Watkinsons should rear their children like brothers and take mutual interest in the education of both," unquote. A number of these newspapers tried to increase the drama of the situation by claiming that these mothers instinctively knew they had the wrong babies, and in the face of these men of science, these experts, telling them that they had the right babies, they swapped them anyway. Take that, science. But in fact, it was Mr. Watkins, one of the fathers, who realized he had the wrong baby, not by any instinct, but by the name tag. And the majority of the experts asked to look into the case believed the babies had been mixed up, even though so much of the science they were using was bunk. On May 23, 1931, over in Philly, Judge Horace Stern approved a suit of divorce brought by Anna Van Stan Watkins against William R. Watkins of Chicago. The decree was granted on the grounds of desertion in 1920 and was going to be finalized the following month. Therefore, Mr. Watkins hadn't finalized his divorce before marrying his second wife. Mrs. Anna said she wouldn't bring bigamy charges against him for the sake of his second child. In August of 1933, the Norwich Sun reported that the hospital continued to maintain the tags were swapped around, not the babies, but the mothers only grew more convinced they had made the correct choice in swapping. However, sometime later, Mr. Watkins suddenly announced, quote, "I think the kid in my home is beginning to look like Bamberger," unquote. I'm thinking he's seeking a motive for another wife and child desertion, in my opinion, allegedly. In the 3 years since the mix-up, neither family had another child, but Mrs. Bamberger said that if she had another, quote, "I would first insist that my husband be present at the time of birth and that he see just where the baby was taken. Also that he remain with the child until it had been fingerprinted and a tag put on it which would not come off in the bathtub," unquote. Mr. Bamberger hadn't wanted any more press on the issue because he said the neighbors laughed at them. But at the time of the 1933 article, he was laid up in the hospital after a floor in an uncompleted building he was working in collapsed and crushed his legs and arms. I tried to find news about this disaster and failed. But the paper also incorrectly referred to the baby boy Bamberger in the article as George William Bamberger, but his name was George Edward Bamberger. In 1935, the Watkinses and the Bambergers held a joint birthday party for Charles Evan Watkins and George Edward Bamberger. The families claimed to be on friendly terms, and the little boys hoped to have joint birthday parties every year. In 1936, Charles Watkins was featured in a bunch of newspapers with a photo of him tying up a roller skate, but after this, I cannot find reliable information about him. However, I learned that George Bamberger married and had a family, and he died at the age of 76 on March 9, 2007 in Illinois. One of the results of the Great Baby Mix-Up was a push for new and better methods for identifying newborns in hospitals, so this wouldn't happen again. Note, it still happens today, but instead of hiring quacks to compare skull shapes, we can just run a DNA test. But back in the 1930s, even blood tests were rudimentary. The rhesus factor of blood hadn't even been discovered. There were bracelets and stickers, and doctors advocated for finger and foot printing to be done shortly after birth for unique identification markers. But according to the Salt Lake Tribune in 1935, quote, many mothers abhor the idea of their babies being fingerprinted, even in infancy, unquote. I guess it was because it was associated with criminals, or maybe it was because it was messy, I don't know. Today, parents treasure newborn hand and footprints, so perhaps the attitude change is something I should look into. Baby history stuff. But anyway, a new concept was floated in the 1930s. Branding babies. You know, burning marks of ownership into the flesh. I mean, it works on cattle, only they were doing it with a UV light. But that will be a topic for another time. I hope you found this interesting. If you did, please like and subscribe. And if you have any swap baby stories, I would love to hear them in the comments, or you could send me an email. If you enjoy my work, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. And of course, thank you for watching.